Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix: a little information, a few stats, some real world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee.
Today's episode is jam-packed. What you didn't see in the news on the strange forces quietly reshaping culture and markets. Wake up ready so you don't get blindsided by this week's inflation, rate, and energy data. A knowledge bomb on rental properties versus REITs. A landlord war story reality check and humor me. A big picture clash over the meaning of housing in the greater debate. And we'll land it all with a let's invent again story about the man who taught robots how to run the modern warehouse.
A quick thank you to our sponsor, Nost Moments at nostmoments.io. Share your most precious memories. Share the Nost Moments. And now we turn your daily dose of "wait, that happened" into actionable insight, mild existential dread, and the occasional laugh.
And every week we pull the curtain back on stories that didn't quite make the headline lottery, but absolutely should have. Because by the time the world starts paying attention, you'll be ahead of it.
Today's edition of What You Didn't See in the News is packed. We're going from ancient Egyptian mysteries to CRISPR wheat, to recycling Teflon, to internet outages, to TikTok's new embrace your weird moment. And yeah, some stocks that basically committed gravity fraud this week. Let's start with a science twofer that sounds like the prologue to a superhero movie. Researchers found a totally new way to recycle Teflon, the forever chemical on your cookware, using nothing but mechanical shaking and sodium metal. Instead of blasting it in ovens that make volcanoes feel insecure, they literally grind it with sodium and break the polymer apart. If this scales, it means cleaner waste streams, fewer toxic sites, and finally, a real solution for a chemical we've regretted inventing for decades. And while that was happening, another lab announced CRISPR-engineered wheat that can make its own fertilizer by pulling nitrogen from the air the way legumes do. That could slash fertilizer use, clean up waterways, and make food production less dependent on a massive ammonia industry.
That's not just science, that's supply chain therapy.
Exactly. One breakthrough helps clean the planet, the other helps feed it. Quiet stories, massive implications. Now, let's rewind a few thousand years. Archaeologists opening a sealed Egyptian tomb this month discovered a treasure trove of burial items: amulets, scroll fragments, a funerary mask, and the inscriptions solved a long-standing mystery about a minor royal dynasty. For decades, nobody could piece together how this family linked to a chaotic political moment. The clues in this tomb basically filled in the missing chapter of the saga. And in a totally different kind of treasure story, an 88-year-old cashier in Michigan, still working long hours just to afford bills, received a $1.7 million gift after a TikTok video about her life went viral. Donations poured in. She's retiring, paying off medical expenses, and finally getting the safety net no one her age should have to wait for.
Ancient pharaohs buried treasure. Modern Americans crowdsource it.
And in both cases, we learn what societies consider valuable, whether that's lineage or kindness. All right, let's talk about the internet falling apart twice this week. On December 3rd and 5th, millions of people found that ChatGPT, Zoom, Spotify, Twitch, and LinkedIn were suddenly down for 40 minutes each. The cause wasn't hackers or solar storms or the AI uprising. It was basically maintenance operations colliding with hidden software bugs, the digital equivalent of tripping over your own shoelaces. What it really shows is how fragile our infrastructure is. A handful of companies run the backbone of everything. One misconfigured update in one data center, and half the planet remembers what silence sounds like.
We used to fear asteroids, now we fear software patches.
Humanity has range. On a gentler note, TikTok is suddenly obsessed with wabi-sabi, this Japanese idea that beauty lives in imperfection. The trend has people sharing the things they used to hide: crooked smiles, scars, messy apartments, awkward quirks, all under the wabi-sabi tag. And it's resonating. Search queries for wabi-sabi meaning and wabi-sabi body image are climbing because people are finally asking what it means to stop editing ourselves into oblivion.
A trend requiring zero ring lights? A miracle.
Just honesty, which is somehow the rarest aesthetic. Now let's talk markets. A few under-the-radar stocks basically strapped on rockets and asked for clearance from air traffic control. TGL, Treasure Global, jumped about 276% in a single day after announcing a restructuring and hinting at new partnerships in digital payments. Small-cap turnaround stories are like catnip for momentum traders. SMX, Security Matters, was up around 135% after releasing updates tied to authentication and supply chain tracking, plus whispers of government interest. Wheeler Real Estate Investment Trust surged almost 100% after new debt restructuring updates suggested the worst might finally be behind them. Nixie warrants soared nearly 80% after the company unveiled enhancements to its AI commerce engine, and traders flocked to the warrants for leverage. And Small Modular Reactor Company, you guessed it, ticker SMR, NuScale Power, climbed steadily this week after the Department of Energy offered up to $800 million to support small modular reactor projects. With AI, crypto, and EVs devouring electricity, nuclear suddenly looks like the adult in the room.
Amazing how quickly investors remember the grid is not infinite.
Everything in 2025 runs on vibes and voltage, and only one of those has a federal budget behind it. Now, let's wake up ready. Your cheat sheet for the week ahead so you can stroll into Monday feeling like you've already read every investor deck, central bank footnote, and macro forecast the rest of the world will pretend they understood. We're going day by day, so let's jump in. So Monday, December 8th, kicks off with New York hosting Bloomberg's Defending the Digital Economy conference, basically the Davos of cyber people who actually ship product. The key question: are we finally spending enough to defend the financial system from attackers who never sleep and never take PTO? The implication? If the answer is no, tech and finance are going to be lobbying for higher budgets by Q1. Meanwhile, NextEra Energy is hosting its investor conference, and this one matters because the whole clean energy sector has been praying for clarity on grid modernization timelines. The question everyone's trying to answer: is 2026 the year utilities finally start spending like they mean it? And then at 5 p.m., we get U.S. consumer inflation expectations, a little number with a big shadow. If long-term expectations creep up, the Fed freaks out. If they fall, markets throw a party.
Basically, Monday is tell us how scared we should be about the next decade day.
Exactly. But Tuesday, December 9th, we go global. Australia steps up first with the RBA rate decision. They're expected to hold, but the real question is, has inflation actually turned the corner down under, or are we in a holding pattern for another quarter? If the RBA hints at future cuts, commodity currencies move, and yes, miners and energy exporters get jumpy. Then we slide right into the NFEB Small Business Optimism Index, which is like a vibe check for every local bakery, HVAC contractor, and scrappy startup founder operating out of a WeWork. If optimism rises, hiring comes next. If it slips, recession Twitter gets loud again. All day, S&P Global is presenting at Goldman's financial conference with one mission: explain credit quality without making anyone fall asleep. And finally, the big energy crowd gathers in Houston for Reuters Energy Live. LNG, grid tech, transition roadmaps. Basically a family reunion for anybody who's ever called Texas to ask about pipeline capacity.
So Australia sets the tone, small business confidence gives the follow-through, and Houston decides energy pricing for the next 6 months.
Which brings us to Wednesday, December 10th, the heavyweight title fight of the week. China starts us off overnight with CPI data. Key question: is China reflating or just floating sideways? If inflation is weak, it signals soft consumer demand, which hits metals, energy, EV supply chains, basically every sector with global in its pitch deck. Then Canada holds its own rate meeting, but everyone's staring at oil forecasts and asking, is a rate hold enough to keep the CAD from drifting? But the real meteor hitting markets lands at 2 p.m., the Federal Reserve decision. A rate cut to 3.75% is expected, but the dot plot, the Fed's attempt at tarot cards, will tell us if tech valuations have more runway or if liquidity is about to tighten again. At 2:30, Powell takes the mic, and the implication is simple. Whatever he says determines whether risk assets smile or curl into the fetal position.
Every trading desk in America pretends to have a model, but really everyone's just asking the same question. Is Jerome chill today?
Yes, fingers crossed. After that, we check in on HPE over at Barclays Tech Conference. AI infrastructure, cloud capex, enterprise demand, the trifecta that decides whether legacy tech is having a comeback moment. And wrapping the day, the EIA petroleum report drops at 4:30 p.m. Crude stocks, gasoline inventories, refinery runs, a weekly reminder that oil markets are still the drama queens of global commodities. Thursday, December 11th, we're back in the U.S. with the Producer Price Index, wholesale inflation. The key question here, are companies finally catching a break on input costs, or are margins about to feel a squeeze? This number is sneaky. It hits industrials, energy, and every hardware supply chain that depends on predictable pricing. We also get the U.S. balance of trade, which tells us whether America is exporting enough tech and importing too much energy. Always a fun equation. That evening, the natural gas storage report arrives, and with winter kicking in, it's basically the weekly mood board for LNG traders. Overnight, we get Australia's employment numbers. Tight labor could delay future rate cuts, which matters for every commodity investor mapping 2026 copper and iron ore flows. Friday, December 12th, starts in Europe with Germany's final inflation. Key question, is Europe stabilizing, or are we still in the grocery bill gasp era? Stable inflation means the ECB can stop acting like the world's strictest hall monitor. And at 7 p.m., the U.S. Baker Hughes rig count hits, your barometer for drilling ambition. More rigs means more supply. Fewer rigs means oil prices might start climbing again.
So basically Friday is, are we drilling and can Europe chill?
Perfect summary. Finally, Sunday the 14th brings Japan's Tankan survey. It's low impact on paper, but high impact for tech watchers because it hints at capex plans from major manufacturers. The question, are Japanese firms gearing up for another hardware cycle? If yes, expect ripple effects across semiconductors, robotics, and global supply chains. And that's your week. A rolling parade of inflation checks, rate decisions, energy inventory drama, and corporate mic drops that all tee up one central question. Is 2026 going to be a year of easing, accelerating, or carefully tiptoeing around recession risk? Whatever happens, you'll walk into it absolutely ready.
And caffeinated. Don't forget caffeinated.
Couldn't forget it if I tried.
All right, folks, gather in close. Today's knowledge bomb is about a classic fork in the financial road. You've got a crisp $100,000 and two very different ways to put it to work. One path leads to a rental property, your own little kingdom of tenants, toilets, and tax forms. The other leads to REITs, those publicly traded real estate machines that let you own buildings without ever touching a wrench. Same dollars, very different vibes. Let's start with the landlord route, because that's where the adventure usually begins. Buying a rental property is the financial equivalent of volunteering for a second job without reading the job description. At first, it sounds noble, passive income, other people paying your mortgage, but then the midnight plumbing leaks, the late rent, and the mysterious mold patches appear, and suddenly you're the CEO, the HR manager, and the facilities team. You can hire a property manager, sure, but they'll take a slice of your rent, which is really just paying someone else to absorb your stress. Still, you get full control. You pick the property, the tenant, the upgrades, the timing of the sale. It's your ship, for better or worse. Investing in REITs is the opposite personality type. You buy the shares, you go back to your life, and professionals do the heavy lifting. They acquire buildings, sign leases, manage maintenance, and send you dividends while you're out living like a reasonable adult. It's passive in the truest sense. The trade-off is that you don't get a say in anything. You're along for the ride, not in the driver's seat. Now let's talk taxes, because this is where the government quietly nudges you and says, I could make that landlord life very, very worth your while. Rental owners get to deduct mortgage interest, repairs, taxes, insurance, and the crown jewel of real estate accounting, depreciation. That little gem lets you write down the building's value over 27 years, shrinking your taxable income even when your real cash flow is strong. And when you eventually sell, a 1031 exchange can punt your tax bill even further down the timeline. REIT investors, meanwhile, don't get this buffet of deductions. Their dividends are taxed as ordinary income. There's a temporary 20% deduction on qualified REIT dividends, but landlords still get the more customized tax treatment. Returns tell another story. A well-chosen rental gives you multiple layers of wealth building. Cash flow every month, appreciation as the property rises in value, and equity growth as tenants quietly pay down your mortgage, and leverage amplifies everything. If a $400,000 home rises just 5% in a year, that's a $20,000 gain, which is a 20% return on your $100,000 down payment. Of course, leverage swings both ways. A serious market downturn can wipe out your equity just as fast. REITs, on the other hand, have long delivered returns in the 9 to 10% range with steady dividends and professional management. They're diversified across dozens or hundreds of properties, so a bad roof or a bad tenant doesn't send your investment into therapy. Risk and liquidity round out the picture. A single rental property puts all your chips on one square. One bad tenant or one expensive repair can turn your elegant wealth-building plan into a personal resilience workshop. REITs spread that risk across regions and sectors, and you can sell them with a tap on your phone. Try doing that with a house. So which path is better? The honest answer is that it depends on the kind of life you want to live while you build wealth. If you crave control, tax advantages, and the satisfaction of improving an asset with your own hands, the landlord route might be your calling. If you prefer passive income, instant diversification, and never having to Google, "Why is my water heater screaming?" REITs might be the love story you've been waiting for. And here's the real knowledge bomb. You don't actually have to choose. Many of the savviest investors blend both. Rentals for tax-favored equity growth, REITs for passive diversified income. Different tools, same mission. The question isn't which is better. The question is which version of wealth building fits the life you actually want to live. And that is your knowledge bomb.
Thanks for that. Means humor me for a second. Here's one that still makes me laugh when I think about it. I had a tenant who was an absolute sweetheart, always paid rent on time, never complained, and even left little thank you notes on the counter when I fixed something quickly. One day he texts me, "Hey, no rush, but the toilet in the master bath is making a weird noise at night." I figure it's probably the fill valve hissing or something minor, so I swing by the next afternoon with my toolbox. He's at work, so I let myself in with the master key. I walk into the master bathroom, lift the tank lid, and there's a full-sized rubber chicken sitting inside the tank, wedged perfectly upright like it's taking a bath. Every time the tank refilled, the water level rose, squeezed the chicken, and it let out this pathetic, muffled squawk that echoed through the pipes at 2 a.m. He'd apparently lost a bet with his brother months earlier, and the penalty was the chicken lives in the tank until the landlord finds it. He fully expected me to discover it within a week and evict him on the spot for unauthorized poultry. Instead, I just sent him a selfie of me and the chicken wearing tiny sunglasses, captioned, "Your roommate and I have reached an understanding. Rent still due on the 1st." He paid me early for the next 6 months, and the chicken got promoted to official property mascot. It's still in there. I replace the rubber when it gets too waterlogged. Current chicken is named Sir Squeaks-a-Lot III. Some tenants trash the place. Others install comedic waterfowl. I'll take the latter every time.
Wealth, that reminds me of one too. I once knew a first-time landlord who was very proud of his new rental property. So proud that he told everyone he'd run it like a business. He read the books, he watched the YouTube tutorials. He even made a color-coded spreadsheet for maintenance schedules. It was beautiful. MBA level. Then came the call. that first late-night ring every landlord eventually gets. "Hi," the tenant whispered urgently. "There's a weird noise coming from the bathroom." "What kind of noise?" he asked, pulling up his maintenance spreadsheet like it might offer emotional support. "It's growling." Growling? He drove over in pajamas, armed with nothing but a wrench he didn't know how to use, and the fading confidence of a man who once believed passive income was actually passive. He opened the bathroom door slowly, ready to confront whatever beast had claimed the toilet as its lair. The growl rumbled again, and then he realized it wasn't a creature. It wasn't a pipe. It was the tenant's electric toothbrush vibrating inside the vanity drawer. But here's the best part. His tenant looked at him deadly serious and said, "Oh, good, I was worried the plumbing was haunted." That was the exact moment our heroic landlord closed his spreadsheet, Googled property managers near me, and accepted the ancient truth. Real estate is passive income in the same way parenthood is just babysitting.
This kind of advice really is priceless.
Speaking of housing, welcome back to the greater debate, the conversation that should happen constantly and almost never does, usually because it ends with someone storming out, someone else Googling eviction law, and everybody agreeing never to talk about housing at the dinner table again. But we stage it anyway, fueled by caffeine, civic optimism, and the unshakable belief that two adults can argue about economic justice without turning the studio into a zoning board cage match. Tonight's greater debate isn't about inflation, mortgage rates, or whether your HOA is a micro-dictatorship. It's about the foundation beneath all of it, what a home means in America. And it pits two leaders who don't just disagree, they speak entirely different dialects of the American dream. In one corner, Representative Maxine Waters, fighter, reformer, sentinel of consumer protection, a woman who treats housing not as an asset class but as a civil right with a leaking roof and a 5-alarm funding shortfall, decades of oversight, billions in proposed investment, unwavering belief in government's duty to correct what the market will not. In the other, President George W. Bush, the architect of the ownership society, the man who tried to turn Americans from renters into stakeholding shareholders of their own futures. Texan optimism, moral clarity, a belief that a set of house keys is the most powerful anti-poverty tool ever invented. And the question tonight cuts straight to the studs. Is housing a public responsibility or a personal cornerstone? Waters steps forward first. And she doesn't clear her throat, she doesn't warm up. She drops straight into the center of the problem like she's testifying under oath on live television. She says millions of Americans don't fail to secure housing because they lack grit. They fail because the system is designed to keep them out. Chronic underfunding, predatory lending, public housing so neglected it becomes a headline or a hazard depending on the year. Then she lands her first knockout. She says you cannot build the American dream on a foundation the market keeps cracking. Not rhetorical flourish, lived history. She calls home ownership a privilege built on exclusions, redlining, appraisal bias, generational inequity, and argues that without massive public investment, the dream will remain gated. The room goes still. And then Bush answers. Not defensively, not nostalgically, calm, steady, almost pastoral. He says home ownership is the heart of American identity, the turning point between instability and stewardship. He reminds us that owning a home builds wealth, the kind passed down, the kind that closes gaps. And then he pivots into message discipline that could be cut directly from a 2004 White House transcript. Homeowners have a stake in the future, he says. And then he lands his punch. The role of government isn't to build the home. It's to clear the barriers so you can. The crowd shifts. Now Waters fires back, and she isn't pulling anything. She says Bush's ownership society wasn't a ladder. It was a trapdoor. That pushing millions into mortgages without robust protections didn't expand the dream. It weaponized it. She compares zero-down loans and deregulation to handing out car keys without brakes. And the subprime crash becomes her Exhibit A. Then she draws blood. Access without safeguards is an opportunity, it's exposure. Bush takes the hit, and then with that disarming Texas directness, he counters. He says the problem wasn't expanding home ownership, it was how it was done. He says speculative lenders, loose underwriting, and regulatory blind spots created the crisis, not the idea of ownership itself. And he argues that government housing programs, when overextended, produce something that looks less like equitable access and more like permanent dependency. Then he drops the cold line. Government can protect people, but it can also trap them. Another body blow. For a moment, both seem cornered, and then the humility phase begins. Waters admits public housing has failed some residents. She says mismanagement exists, bureaucracy exists, but she says those failures come from starvation, not excess. You cannot chronically underfund a system and then blame the tenants for the mold. Bush concedes too. He admits he pushed hard for home ownership, maybe too hard, and that some families were placed into homes they weren't prepared to maintain. And yes, lenders took advantage, but he stands firm. The dream itself wasn't the problem. And then the gloves fully come off. Waters says the market has never corrected racial injustice. Not once, not on its own. She says relying on profit incentives to deliver fairness is like relying on gravity to deliver a parachute. She argues the state must intervene because the American dream didn't become exclusionary by accident. It became exclusionary by design. Bush responds with a counterpunch sharpened by 8 years of Oval Office battles. He says government can provide opportunity, but it cannot manufacture prosperity. That large-scale public housing often becomes what he calls the architecture of stagnation, that people thrive when they build, not when they receive. And then he lands the cracked rib line. A dream handed down isn't the same as a dream earned. Now nobody is blinking. Waters closes by saying housing is dignity, and dignity requires structural investment, that you cannot mortgage your way out of inequity, that families don't need rhetoric, they need roofs. Bush closes by saying a home is the start of personal responsibility, an anchor for families, neighborhoods, democracy itself, and that the dream should be accessible to all who work for it, not rationed by bureaucracy. And that's where the anxiety settles in the room. Because both are right about the problem they see, and both are wrong about the danger they underestimate. Waters underestimates how much people crave the pride of ownership. Bush underestimates how brutally markets can punish the unprotected. Housing as a right versus housing as a responsibility. Stability versus agency. Equity versus autonomy. This debate won't end tonight. It'll end 30 years from now, in the wealth or the absence of it, held by the families shaped by these philosophies. And that is the greater debate.
All right, fellow tinkerers. Today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most quietly influential innovators of the 21st century. Someone whose work touches your life every time you click Buy Now. Order paper towels at midnight, or marvel at how your package materializes on your porch before you even remember ordering it. Let's invent again with Peter Werman. And if Silicon Valley ever carves out a Mount Rushmore for people who turned algorithms into infrastructure, this man gets his own granite cheekbone. Werman wasn't born into robotics royalty. He wasn't soldering circuits at age 5 or building exoskeletons out of junkyard parts. He was a kid in Wisconsin who used his bar mitzvah money to buy an Apple II, back when software was so scarce you had to write your own. That's where the spark began. Not the love of machines, but the love of solving hard problems with logic and code. He follows that spark to MIT for mechanical engineering, then to the University of Michigan for a master's, another master's, and eventually a PhD in computer science. Academia becomes his launch pad, but not his destination. Because the thing that changes everything, the inflection point, comes in 2003. Werman teams up with Mick Mounts, who had a front-row seat to warehouse inefficiencies while working at Webvan, and Raffaello D'Andrea, a robotics mastermind from Cornell. Mounts brings the problem, D'Andrea brings the robotics, Werman brings the architecture. Together, they build something that looks simple but required a conceptual backflip. Instead of workers walking miles to find products, why not make the shelves come to them? That question becomes the Kiva system. Picture hundreds, eventually thousands, of small orange robots gliding across a warehouse floor. Each one slides under a shelving unit, lifts it up, and carries it to a human who stays put at a workstation. No wandering, no guesswork, no chaos, just a steady flow of inventory arriving exactly where and when it's needed. But the real innovation, the thing that turns this from a clever gadget into a logistics revolution, is Werman's software. He builds the orchestration layer, a multi-agent system that knows where every robot, every shelf, every order, and every pathway is at all times. It assigns robots to tasks, optimizes routes second by second, and keeps an entire robotic city from crashing into itself. It doesn't just move shelves, it conducts them. That's why companies like Staples and Walgreens adopt the system almost immediately. It cuts walking time, reduces injuries, increases throughput, and transforms the warehouse from a human maze into a synchronized robot ballet. And then Amazon steps in. In 2012, they buy Kiva Systems for $775 million. And in a move straight out of a strategy playbook, they stop selling the technology to competitors. Kiva becomes Amazon Robotics. The system becomes Amazon's secret weapon. And a decade later, what started as a few hundred robots is now over 1 million, coordinated, optimized, upgraded with AI, and embedded into nearly every major fulfillment center. This is why your orders arrive absurdly fast. This is why Amazon can handle holiday surges without melting down. This is why logistics shifted from big buildings full of people to automated ecosystems that never sleep. Werman eventually moves on, first to an AI startup, then to Sony AI, where he's now helping build the next generation of learning systems, including game-playing agents that outperform human champions. But the legacy of his warehouse invention keeps expanding. Think about the ripple effects. It transformed warehouse work from miles of walking to minutes of picking. It accelerated the rise of same-day delivery. It forced every major retailer to reinvent its fulfillment strategy. It sparked a robotics arms race that still hasn't slowed. And it demonstrated that massively coordinated robots aren't sci-fi, they're just infrastructure. Werman took something mundane, warehouse picking, and treated it like an optimization problem worthy of a moonshot. And because he solved it, he gave modern commerce the operating system it didn't know it needed. Packages arrive faster because of him. Robots cooperate because of him. And businesses at global scale run smoother because one inventor decided that an inefficient warehouse was a puzzle worth solving. That's the story of Peter Werman, quiet visionary, algorithmic architect, and the man who taught robots how to move like a workforce. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the range from ancient tombs to crisper wheat, from forever chemicals to internet fragility, from TikTok's wabi-sabi moment to stocks pulling gravity-defying stunts, and all the way to the robots quietly running your front porch.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, Nost Moments, because the best investments are still your memories.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.